December 17, 1944, 03:15 hours. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The frost clung to every branch like crystalline death, and the silence before dawn carried the weight of 26 German divisions poised for Hitler's final gamble. Oberst Heinrich Müller adjusted his field glasses against the bitter cold, his breath forming ice clouds in air so sharp it seemed to cut the lungs. Through the skeletal trees, he could see the American positions, thin, scattered, unprepared. The temperature had plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, making this the coldest winter in European memory, colder than any in 60 years. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved along the line, and somewhere in the darkness, a German soldier whispered a prayer his frozen lips could barely form. This was to be the hour of reckoning. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, would split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp, buying Germany time to negotiate from strength. The plan was audacious. 3 armies, 250,000 men, sweeping through the thinly held Ardennes sector, where American commanders believed the Germans would never attack. In the pre-dawn blackness, German officers shared a confidence born of desperation and necessity. They had studied their enemy. American soldiers, they believed, were soft, wealthy, undisciplined, pampered children of abundance, who would scatter like leaves before the concentrated fury of German arms. The artillery barrage that would signal the offensive was set to begin in 45 minutes. As Müller consulted his watch, he reflected on what German intelligence had told them about their opponents. The Americans fought, as captured German documents would later reveal, with chaotic methods, wasteful expenditure of ammunition, and relied on material superiority rather than tactical skill. German prisoners interviewed after previous engagements had consistently reported that Americans shot wildly at suspected positions and avoided close combat. They were rich in resources, but poor in warrior spirit. At least, this was what German officers had convinced themselves to believe. At precisely 05:30 hours, the German guns opened fire. The sound was like the world splitting apart, a rolling thunder that shattered the frozen silence and sent wildlife fleeing in panic through the snow-laden forest. For 90 minutes, German artillery pounded American positions along an 85-mile front. This was supposed to be the easy part, a lightning thrust through weak defenses, followed by a race to the sea. German tank commanders gunned their engines, confident that by Christmas they would be celebrating in Antwerp. But in those first hours of battle, as German assault troops moved forward through the smoke and snow, they encountered something that would shatter their preconceptions and ultimately seal the fate of the Reich. The Americans did not break. Instead, what German forces encountered in those frozen forests was something their doctrine had not prepared them for, an enemy possessed of such overwhelming firepower that it seemed to transform night into day, silence into a symphony of destruction. The reaction would come not in retreat, but in the form of artillery concentrations so massive, so precisely coordinated, so relentlessly sustained, that veteran German officers, men who had fought from Poland to Stalingrad, would struggle to comprehend what they were witnessing. Within hours of the initial assault, German attack formations found themselves not advancing triumphantly through broken American lines, but instead calling desperately for reinforcements as they encountered defensive fire unlike anything they had experienced. The thin American positions, rather than crumbling, began to pour forth a volume of artillery fire that seemed to violate the very laws of military economy. Where German doctrine dictated careful husbanding of ammunition, precise fire missions, and calculated risk, the Americans responded with what appeared to be industrial-scale warfare. Continuous, overwhelming, seemingly limitless barrages that lit the winter sky like a false dawn. The first indication that this offensive would not proceed according to plan came from the northern shoulder of the attack, where the 99th Infantry Division, green troops who had never seen combat, held firm against crack SS Panzer divisions. Here, American forward observers, many of them barely out of their teens, began calling down fire missions that would have consumed a German artillery battalion's monthly ammunition allocation in a single morning. The response was immediate and catastrophic for the attacking Germans. Battery after battery of American 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers opened fire in coordinated missions that demonstrated not just firepower, but a systematic approach to battlefield dominance that German officers had never encountered. The Americans possessed something the German army had lost over 3 years of attrition warfare: abundance. Not just in shells and guns, but in the industrial capacity to sustain such expenditure indefinitely. Behind every American artillery battery stood the productive might of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and 100 other industrial cities that had converted their peacetime capacity to the manufacture of destruction. As German assault formations pressed forward through the snow-heavy forest, they began to encounter evidence of this abundance in its most tangible form. American artillery shells fell not in the carefully measured concentrations that German experience suggested, but in continuous, rolling barrages that seemed to have no regard for ammunition conservation. One German prisoner, captured on the second day of the offensive, would later tell his interrogators that the American artillery fire was methodical, schematic, and wasteful. But he said this with a tone of awed respect rather than criticism. The mathematical reality was staggering. American industrial production had reached levels that German military planners found literally incredible. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 193,000 artillery pieces and more than 11 million tons of artillery ammunition. This was not just superior to German production, it was superior to German comprehension. The United States was manufacturing artillery shells at a rate that exceeded Germany's entire monthly ammunition production every 3 days. To German officers accustomed to rationing every round, the American approach to artillery fire seemed less like military tactics and more like geological forces unleashed. But it was not merely the quantity that stunned German commanders, it was the quality of coordination. American artillery operated under a fire direction system that allowed battalion, divisional, and corps-level guns to mass their fires on single targets within minutes of a forward observer's call. A German attack that encountered resistance from a single American infantry company might suddenly find itself under fire from 12 or 15 artillery battalions simultaneously. The effect was not just destructive, it was psychologically devastating. Oberst Klaus Weber, commanding a regiment in the 12th SS Panzer Division, would write in his post-battle report that the American artillery response seemed supernatural in its speed and weight. His unit, attacking toward the village of Butgenbach, encountered what he described as a wall of fire that made the earth tremble like an earthquake. Weber, a veteran of campaigns in Russia, where he had learned to respect Soviet artillery, noted that even the massed guns of the Red Army had not prepared him for the systematic obliteration that American artillery could deliver. The psychological impact on German troops was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had endured the massive Soviet barrages at Kursk and Stalingrad reported that American artillery was different, not necessarily more intense, but more persistent, more accurate, and somehow more personal. Soviet artillery came in great concentrated storms that passed like weather. American artillery seemed to follow German formations, adjusting and readjusting, maintaining contact, wearing down not just positions but morale with a relentlessness that spoke of unlimited resources behind it. The sound itself became a character in the battle. German veterans described the whistle of incoming American shells as somehow different from other artillery. Sharper, more numerous, arriving in sequences that suggested not military necessity but industrial excess. The shells arrived with mathematical precision, but in quantities that seemed to mock the very concept of military economy. One captured German sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division told his American interrogators that listening to American artillery was like hearing a factory that manufactured thunder. By the 3rd day of the offensive, German unit commanders were reporting phenomena that violated everything they understood about artillery warfare. American batteries seemed capable of sustained fire missions that would have exhausted German ammunition stocks in hours. More disturbing still, American guns appeared to have unlimited ability to shift fires, mass on targets, and then return to independent missions without the lengthy coordination delays that characterized German artillery doctrine. The speed with which American artillery could respond to calls for fire suggested not just better communications, but a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between infantry and supporting arms. The reality behind this perceived miracle was American industrial abundance operating at a scale that rendered previous military calculations obsolete. Each American artillery battalion was supported by ammunition trains that carried more shells than many German divisions possessed in total. Behind these trains stood depot systems that had been designed not for military efficiency, but for industrial throughput. The United States had applied mass production techniques to warfare itself, creating a logistical system that treated artillery shells like manufactured goods rather than precious military assets. The German officers' initial confidence had been based on a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of their enemy. They had expected to fight Americans, individuals who might be wealthy but were presumably soft and undisciplined. Instead, they found themselves fighting America itself, an industrial civilization that had devoted its productive capacity to the systematic destruction of German military power. The artillery shells that fell like steel rain on German positions carried with them the accumulated might of American steel mills, copper mines, explosive plants, and transportation networks operating at wartime capacity. As the offensive stalled and German casualties mounted, captured officers began to speak with something approaching awe about American firepower. General Major Friedrich Kittel, taken prisoner after his division was shattered near St. Vith, observed that fighting Americans was like fighting an entire factory. He elaborated that German soldiers had grown accustomed to rationing ammunition, calculating each shot, making every round count, because there might not be another. American soldiers, he noted, seemed to operate under the assumption that there would always be more ammunition, more shells, more of everything. This abundance was not merely material, it was psychological. American forward observers called for fire missions, with a confidence that came from knowing their requests would be answered. German observers, by contrast, had learned to request only what was absolutely necessary, knowing that artillery support was precious and finite. The result was a multiplication of American firepower that went beyond simple numerical superiority. American artillery was not just more numerous, it was more freely used, more readily available, more willing to expend vast quantities of ammunition on targets that German doctrine would have ignored as too marginal to justify the cost. The shells themselves became symbols of American abundance. Each 155mm artillery round represented tons of steel, pounds of high explosives, precision manufacturing, and complex logistics. Yet Americans fired them with what appeared to German observers as casual disregard for their value. A single American artillery barrage might consume more ammunition than a German division would see in a month, and yet the Americans seemed capable of repeating such barrages indefinitely. The sound of American artillery became the sound of American industry itself, methodical, relentless, overwhelming in its mechanical persistence. By December 20th, as the German offensive ground to a halt in the face of stiffening American resistance, the artillery factor had become decisive, not just tactically but psychologically. German soldiers reported that the constant threat of American artillery fire made movement dangerous, concentration impossible, and rest elusive. Unlike the German experience with Soviet artillery, which came in massive but brief concentrations, American artillery seemed omnipresent, capable of finding and destroying targets anywhere, anytime, with a persistence that wore down German morale as much as German positions. The voices of German prisoners, recorded in interrogation transcripts that survived the war, reveal a profound shift in perception. Initial confidence gave way to bewildered respect, then to something approaching fatalistic acceptance. The Americans, observed one captured German major, fight as if they have already won the war and are merely completing paperwork. Another prisoner noted that American artillery fire demonstrated the difference between a military force and an industrial process. But perhaps the most telling comment came from Oberst Heinrich Müller himself, captured after his regiment was destroyed in the fighting around Elsenborn Ridge. Asked by his American interrogators about the effectiveness of German tactics, Müller replied with weary honesty, "We came to fight soldiers, but found ourselves fighting a civilization." When pressed to elaborate on what he meant, he gestured toward the sound of American artillery still thundering in the distance and said simply, "Listen, that is not military fire. That is American industry expressing itself in steel and explosives. Artillery shells that fell on German positions throughout the battle of the Bulge carried more than high explosives. They carried the accumulated weight of American productive capacity, technological innovation, and industrial organization. Each shell represented not just military ordnance, but a fragment of Detroit's assembly lines, Pittsburgh's steel mills, the copper mines of Montana, the chemical plants of Delaware. German soldiers, accustomed to fighting with carefully rationed resources, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited means and the will to employ them without hesitation. As the German offensive finally collapsed in late December, and American forces began their counterattack, captured German officers spoke with something approaching philosophical resignation about their encounter with American firepower. They had planned to exploit American softness and inexperience, but instead had discovered American abundance and industrial might. The artillery fire that had shattered their attacks represented more than military tactics. It represented the productive power of an entire continent devoted to warfare. The winter wind that howled through the Ardennes carried with it the sound of American guns, a mechanical symphony that spoke not of individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but of systematic, industrial-scale warfare conducted by a nation that had transformed its peacetime economy into an engine of military production. For German officers who had begun the offensive confident in their superior training and experience, this encounter with American abundance marked not just a tactical defeat, but a revelation about the nature of modern warfare itself. In the frozen forests of Belgium, as German formations retreated through the snow they had advanced through with such confidence only days before, the sound of American artillery continued to echo through the winter air. It was the sound of an empire at war, not the desperate fury of a cornered enemy, but the methodical, systematic application of overwhelming industrial power to the problem of German resistance. For those who survived to hear it, that sound would remain in memory as the voice of America itself, abundant, relentless, and ultimately irresistible. The shells that had lit the night like day had carried with them a message more profound than any tactical communication. This was what American democracy looked like when it went to war. Not elegant, not particularly heroic, but possessed of resources so vast and organization so thorough that resistance itself became a form of mathematical impossibility. The German officers who had laughed at the frozen front discovered that American artillery could indeed light the night like day, and that in that artificial daylight, the shadows of the Third Reich had nowhere left to hide.